Good evening, and welcome to this month's final installment of Controversial Blackness. I'm Paul Jackson, and on behalf of my colleagues, Ben Ratzloff, Amrit Troon, under the guidance of African American Studies graduate student Christine Goding, and under the mentorship of Professor Barner Hesse, I'd like to thank you for joining us on this evening as we dive once more this month, into controversial blackness. As you may have come to discover this month, controversial blackness is not just an idea or an event, or just a set of discussions or debates. No, it has been a series of moments of controversial intervention on the matters of what blackness is, what blackness means, and how blackness might be newly understood. As my colleagues and I have defined it, bear with me, controversial blackness is intellectually irredeemable and disreputable. It disrupts the normative discourses of racial respectability and racial uplift that surrounds politics, culture, and the academy, simply because it can. It interjects from and into the margins, polemics, and indecorous texts of African American studies, problematizing and radicalizing its conceptual limits. By staging these interventions, controversial blackness explores and exposes the unsettled tensions and unaccountable conventions of African American studies, returning it to the facts of blackness with uncomfortably new ways of seeing, hearing, touching, and questioning its forbidden territories. In pursuit of the forbidden territories of blackness this month, we were able to hear talks delivered by the committee on questions of controversial blackness and the possibilities or impossibilities of racial justice. We were able to hear incredible interventions by Professor D. Slayini Madison, Professor Nick Davis, and Professor Sherwin Bryant, and hear renowned artist Kara Walker speak about her artistic handling of a very controversial blackness. And tonight, we're joined by four very special guests for this controversial Black Question Time. This is Controversial Black Question Time. I'm Paul Jackson, and I'd like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Professor in the African American Studies Department, Barner Hesse. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Welcome to Controversial Black Question Time. I've been asked to say something controversial by some of the students here, but I'm going to resist saying anything controversial this evening. So what I'd like to do is tell you something about the rules of question time. Now, we've solicited a number of questions from different students, some of whom are here today, one of whom is in London and on Skype, I can see. Hello, Phyllis. How are you doing? She's waving for those who cannot see. And I'm going to call out these questions in random order. When I call out the name of the questioner, he or she will stand up, pose the question, and then I'll pick out people from the panel to respond randomly. I may interrupt the panel on occasions to clarify points, not to be rude, although it might look like that. And we will have an opportunity when the questions have been answered by the panel to go back to the student, get some feedback, and then have some wider discussion. So I'd like to begin with the first question, and the first questioner is Dallas Wright, who's from the south side of Chicago, is a recent graduate of Northwestern University with a degree in journalism. Dallas.
All right, so my question has to do with Chris Dorner. Rest in peace. So considering the events of earlier this month surrounding Mr. Dorner, I just am curious as the panel, would you consider him a villain, a tragic hero, or a mixture of both? And then also, what was this story have to do? What does it tell us kind of about institutional and systematic racism in the United States, as well as maybe, hints of fascism to come?
So this is a question about Christopher Dorner, the police officer who was recently on the run and was shot, was killed by the police officers who cornered him. Was he a tragic hero or a villain? Does this story have anything to tell us about institutional racism? Joey Mogul.
Well, thanks for the question. I have to say I'm someone who resists either or. I've always hated multiple choice questions. So I'm not gonna, do I think he's a tragic hero or villain? Or I think we can all be mixtures of both. In this case, I think that his story is illuminating and enlightening. I think that I have no doubt about the legitimacy and the truth and a great deal of the problems he had with the LAPD. The fact is that we still see systemic racism, structural racism within police departments nationwide. In his case, I'm not going to lie, I did not have an opportunity to read his entire manifesto, but I did read some of it. And what he described, I have no doubt that he, like other officers, could have been, in his case, could have, while other officers have been retaliated against by the police department for whistleblowing or for telling the truth about physical abuse or physical assault or other types of misconduct that occurred. I have no doubt that the legitimacy to that type of claim. I can also say that he described the racist language that his fellow officers used and how they did it with glee and with joy, and that they were never punished whatsoever. And just so that you know, my background is I work at the People's Law Office. I'm an attorney, and I represent individuals who are victims and survivors of police misconduct, including in the Chicago police torture cases. And I can personally attest and tell you how many of the white officers involved in the systemic and racist torture of over 100 African American men and women on the south side of Chicago, how many of them we have deposed and how many of them have unabashedly and shamelessly described how they use the nigger word. The word, and excuse me for saying it, but I think it's important to say in this context, and how they have no problem doing so. And the idea that that is what Dorner was subjected to, that his fellow officers were using that, and that when he tried to call them out, he was the one who was isolated, he was the one made to feel ashamed. Do I think that that condones the actions he is accused of? No, I don't. I don't think that, but I also think whatever he's accused of should not be used as an excuse to erase the institutional and structural racism and the brutality and the code of silence that he was attempting to call out in his last final days.
Okay. Just before I move on, I realize in my eagerness to continue with this controversial question time, I forgot to introduce the panelists. So that was my first controversial move. So my name is Barney Hesse. I teach in the African American Studies Department. On my far right, I don't mean that in any particular way, is Father Michael Pfleger.
I'm on a timeout over here. Did I do something wrong?
Who's a pastor at St. Sabina Church here in Chicago. On the far left is Lisa Calvente, who's an assistant professor at DePaul University. And next to me is Joey Mogul, who's an attorney at the People's Law Office. So, Father Pfleger, how would you like to respond to this question?
I think what Joey said I agree with. I think that obviously, first of all, police departments across the country are well known for their racial profiling and their institutional racism. And LAPD certainly has a long history. And New York had a long history. Chicago has a long history. After 9/11, everybody forgot about the police officers of New York before 9/11 of what they were known for. But LAPD has a long history of it. Do I think he's a villain or a hero? Neither. I think he's a victim, and I think he's also a perpetrator because he made decisions out of it. The tragedy for me is that those days following the hunting for him and looking for him was this massive marketing tool by the LAPD and by media in general to make him the villain and to make him just a pure murderer. And unfortunately, I hoped and I thought, but I expected that then or now, we'll never deal with what led him to the breaking point, what led him to the outrage, what led him to make the decision that he has nothing to live for and so he doesn't care, and so he is going to take the only justice he knows because the system didn't provide him with any justice. So the tragedy to me in the case is that once again in America, we'll never deal with what he went through. We'll never deal with the ignoring of the justice, and we'll never look at the other side of that coin. We'll paint him, except for those people who knew him closely or were friends of his, we'll always paint him as the murderer who murdered 4 people. And that's the real tragedy. The real tragedy is not just his death and the death of the other 4 people, but again, the death of truth. and the depth of reality of facing the truth.
Okay, Lisa Calvente, and I'm also wondering if you can say anything about whether this story says something about institutional racism.
Well, I'm going to take it somewhat to institutional racism. To me, what it speaks to is basically the real effects of state violence, right? So when we say that he took on a sense of justice that he knew, we need to understand that this is coming from an ex-police officer, an ex-Marine in that sense, right? So this is a state-produced notion of violence, right? And what that's connected to is basically how the US narrative is built, right? And the core of this narrative in the United States is a core of hypermasculine violence, right? And that's what we need to basically break apart here, right? This narrative of the nation as something that is the equivalent to the normalization of hypermasculinity and violent hypermasculinity. And that's basically how he responded.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
Because I really like what you said, because it touched off something else, the thing that I work with.
You should sit closer. I'm not sure if the other panelists is
Yeah, I
going
didn't know if I thought it was my
no,
breath or I didn't know what it was.
Time out is over.
Punishment,
Just, not too close, but come close.
But the whole violence thing is that I work a lot with brothers on the street in what others would call gangs or I call organizations. And it always amazes me in America when we say, well, how come this brother turns to violence as his first line of offense? Why are we surprised with that? We live in a violent culture. We live in a violent country that is taught violence. Chuck Hagel, who just got approved as Secretary of Defense, when he was named Secretary of Defense candidate by Barack Obama, immediately Republicans and Democrats, because he said that violence or war needs to be the last choice made, it also should be talking, negotiations, sanctions, and this whole list of things, they called him weak. They called him weak. Because his first thing was not to be able to say we're going to declare war on Iran and we're going to go after North Korea. So there's a culture. So when we do it as a government, or we send drones in, or we kill as a country, which is our first line of answer to any problems now, and then it happens on the street, that's the violent creature on the street, or this ex-police officer went to violence. But we're a country of violence, and we do violence all the time, and yet we name some as wrong violence and others justifiable actions. And until we wrestle with those larger questions, I really think we're hypocrites.
I want to add one thing to that as well, because I appreciate what both the speakers said, and I want to add, I think, the other thing that's lost in this whole Dorner scandal and story is that during the manhunt, when the LAPD was looking, they shot up. They shot at several civilians, including 2 Latino women in a car. I don't know how they mistake these Latino women to be Mr. Dorner himself, right? And I think it gets at what we deem as violence. So when it's violence committed by a civilian, which is in this case Dorner, then we consider it a crime. But when it's state-sanctioned violence, when it's police officers who commit violence, then we don't call it violence. We say it's justifiable, or it's, the means justify the ends. I mean, that's in fact, I think, at the heart of the story around the Chicago police torture cases, is that for years, individuals were being tortured on the South Side, and we never called it torture, because it was state-sanctioned violence. And so I just want to add to that. I think that this is, as Father Pfleger said, this is a violent culture, and it's a violent society. And here these acts, he was trained to be violent in this way. Right. But once he takes that uniform off, or he's been fired and that uniform comes off, then he's condemned for the violence he's been trained to commit.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Dallas. Do you want to respond to anything you've heard?
I do agree with the state-sanctioned violence part. Also, it's interesting, as I didn't really know a lot about the story at all until a friend of mine, Raul, made me sit down and look at everything. And the audio recordings they have when they were like, burn him out, it's not like a question, it's just a follow-up. That sort of, to burn someone out of a building is again, it's not really, it hasn't been talked about in any sort of barbaric or violent way. It's just protocol, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Other points or questions from the audience? Anyone? You've got the mic. Kellen.
It reminds me of native son.
Okay. Could you elaborate a little bit what you mean by that?
The chase.
You mean Native Son written by the African-American author Richard Wright?
That's right.
Okay. That we've all read?
That's right.
Which is why you didn't have to fill it out.
That's right.
Any other points? Or should I move on to the next question? Okay. Don't make this harder than it is, please. Okay, the next question comes from Carice F. Oh, Phyllis Duggan. Can Phyllis, who's in London, pose this question?
Yeah, I'll say it for Phyllis.
Okay, so Carice F. is going to pose this
right.
question. And Carice, you're studying African American Studies and Social Policy,
Yeah.
Northwestern.
So Phyllis's question is, do you think the fight for racial equality has now become a quest for white validation? And it's the second part. Are Black people now just requesting access and acceptance into space instead of demanding the dismantling of those spaces?
So has the fight for racial equality now become a quest for white validation? And are Black people just requesting access and acceptance into white spaces instead of demanding the dismantling of those spaces? Lisa Calvente.
I knew you were going to pick me for this one.
Well, not originally, but just changed my mind.
That's okay. Okay, so I just want to break down this question first because there's a lot of things going on in this question. In terms of this fight for racial equality as now becoming a quest for white validation, I don't know if it's a now thing, right? Because historically, we have seen evidence of peoples of the Black diaspora and minorities in general, aiming to be accepted, right? To belong in terms of whiteness and white space, white privilege. And that's okay, right? And I'm saying that because when we think about the struggle over hegemony, right? When we think about these struggles for power and empowerment, it's never a pure victory, right? As Stuart Hall argues, right? As cultural studies argues. It's always about, spaces to be won or lost in particular times and spaces, right? In particular contexts. So that's the first answer, right? In terms of requesting access and acceptance, I think access and acceptance are two different things, right? So you can basically demand access to agency and have that be your form of resistance, right? So basically transforming these white spaces into a different kind of space, disrupting those spaces, is a form of resistance in itself, right? And then in terms of acceptance, well, that again is linked to the first answer, right? There are going to be people that want to be accepted and want nice things, right? Things that we seem to see people with privileges have, right? And another cultural studies theorist said, well, responded in a kind of Marxist, post-Marxist way. Marx wanted everyone to be rich, not poor, right? And that's the point, right? Access, right, and the striving for access is, something that we're going to do because we would like nice things too, in that sense, right? We want equality.
So what are you actually saying? Are you saying that...
I'm saying access to agency
Right.
is resistance in itself because we don't have that access in certain spaces. That's what I'm saying.
So when the questioner is referring to white spaces, do you have any white spaces in mind? Do you have white spaces at DePaul University, for example?
I would argue that the university is a white space.
Right.
Right? So, you know, programs, ethnic studies programs, particular courses that discuss controversial blackness are, you know, an appropriation of those spaces within that space and, you know, a striving for access to that agency, right? And our very presence here is dismantling those notions of white spaces.
Okay. Just before I move on to Michael Pfleger, I just want to announce we've been joined by Michele Rogers, who's an assistant dean at Kellogg School of Management. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, and I'm very embarrassed.
Well, then I don't need to say any more. Michael Pfleger.
You know, Dr. King spoke when, during the Civil Rights Movement, when there was this great move for integration. And he said, at one point, he said, we have called our people to move into integration. What we've done is we've walked them into a burning house. And he said, but what do we do when we're in a burning house? And Harry Belafonte said, now that you've got us in a burning house that's burning up and going down, what do you want? He said, then our job, he said, in the burning house is to put out the fire. And there was this great sense that if we were there was going to be a succession of equal rights that had to be integrated and had to be, so we, you know, went through all those tools of not just the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and lunch counters and the rest, but it was also the sense of integrating every space that there wouldn't be white spaces, which obviously never happened. But I think that the real sense of quest for white validation does not come so much, in my experience, from the African-American perspective, but comes from the white perspective that says, this is what you must be for me to validate you. So if you act like I want you to act, if you speak like I want you to speak, if you like the music I like you like, if you talk the way I'm going to talk, then I can accept, I'll validate you. And the problem became when anybody looks for validation from anybody, but from oneself and from one's own identity. But I think the issue was not so much of African Americans or Hispanics or Asian or anybody trying to say, how do I get to this white validation? But it was the bar was set saying, if you're to become validated as a human being, you must fall into what I accept as approved by you and validates you. And it comes in the whole, you know, and then it gets in the whole melting pot theory, you know, that we're just all the same, and that white liberalism, I don't see color and I don't see difference. Well, no, do see color and do see difference and do see uniqueness and do see beauty. But I think that the white validation thing came from the Caucasian race, not from the African American race.
But isn't there a sense in which, as the question seems to imply, that racial equality ultimately, if it's to be successful, requires white validation? I mean, white's the majority.
That's the belief of the society that is white run, yeah.
Right.
But, you know, and that's why going back to what you mentioned about the access, until we look at, access and diversity at every single level. And let's take Northwestern. And look at Northwestern level and see how much diversity there is in power, in board, in pensions, in legal department, in where they invest their money. And I look all the way through the diversity. We always sometimes look at diversity, what we have in the student body. Let's look at it from where all their money is spent. Let's look for where their investments are made, where their pensions. What's the legal counsels for the Northwestern, or for any university? We just happen to be at Northwestern. But so, until there's equal access and there's a table where it's in every department and every room is equally sat at by all people, the kitchen table is big enough for everybody, we perpetuate saying that we feel that we've diversified because we do it in some areas. And then the whole white validation thing comes again, the superiority. Superiority says that we decide, what looks diversified. We decide if we're diversified, and we decide what's validation. Mm-hmm. And we've set the bar of definition. If I was a minister, I'd say, Jesus saying, who do you say that I am? And we're going to probably know, who do you say I am? What's my identity? And that's a society we live in, though. We always want to define and redefine and tell somebody what their worth is, what their success is, what their status is, and if they're validated.
Okay.
Well, we can't stop at, can I?
Please.
Okay. No. We can't stop at diversity on all levels, right? And the reason why I say that is, even if we had a table of, something like the United Colors of Benetton, right? We had a table
Oh
of
my
all
goodness.
peoples in that sense. That does not necessarily mean that there's a diversity of ideas, right? And so I think we need to focus on that as well, right? So when I say access to agency, I'm saying that this access can be a possible space of resistance, but it might not necessarily be. Just because that person is, a person of color or a person of the Black diaspora does not necessarily mean that radical politics will then follow, right?
Exactly, and that's what I mean by saying if some, and I agree with you 100%, because we can say we're diversified because we've got somebody in that grouping who thinks like
Absolutely.
I think. And that's what I mean, the validation comes from the top down. So you can come in here and you can be of any race, every color, any gender, but guess what? As long as you think this way, so there's still no diversity. We just put a few things on the plate.
Joey Mogul. I had to come to you.
I think it's a hard question for me to answer. I guess I just want to say that, in the area that I do most of my work is in the criminal legal system, and what I also write about is about the criminal legal system. And I personally think that, for example, where I see this at play, and I don't think it's just amongst Black people, I think it's amongst all marginalized groups, right? People of color, queer and trans people, women, all folks, all sorts of marginalized people is always looking for that state recognition. And it becomes this issue of the politics of respectability. And basically it is saying we want to be equal to you without recognizing that what you're seeking equality in is inherently unjust and unequal. And so I think, for example, what we see, which is a problem, and I think it's driving mass incarceration, but right now is that, for example, we do see marginalized groups saying we want to be treated equally like white victims, or we want to be treated equally like heterosexual or gender conforming victims. So therefore hate crimes is something that we should use. And so that people recognize racist and homophobic and sexist violence. We've seen that grow out of the domestic violence movement as well. And I want to, and that said, I think for those of individuals who are continuing to say that they want to have equal representation and equal punishment from the criminal legal system, that you're then buying into an inherently unjust, oppressive system that will never be equal, that will always marginalize and persecute people of color, whether they're heterosexual or gay or gender conforming or gender non-conforming. And I'm talking about, queer and trans folks of color particularly. So, in that sense, I think, I wish that we had a larger conversation where we weren't pushing for hate crimes per se, but we were saying, what can we do to dismantle the criminal legal system as we know it? And I don't think, but I think that's one example where we see this politics of respectability at play.
So coming to you, Michele, we're trying to discuss the question whether the fight for racial equality has now become a quest for white validation, whether Black people should be trying to dismantle these spaces. What do you think?
As usual, I have a different perspective because I come from the business school. So we look at everything from ROI. Everything's an ROI. Is it a return on invested time, return on cash you invest, return on your interest, whatever it is ROI. So I think what happens is we might want to consider some of the more revolutionary ideas you have, but at the same time, you need people doing some of those other things that are infiltrating the system. Because the people who are doing the armed revolution are never going to get in the system. They just make everything happen. It's sort of a case of
Armed revolution?
Well, I mean, when I don't mean real arms,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
saying something really drastic.
Right,
Right.
okay.
Well, it's good to know that I'm in the pocket of armed revolutionaries. But okay.
Actually, I stole that from Natasha because she likes to use that term, but it means doing something radical.
Right.
I think she means something more serious. I mean radical. But I think if you take the example of Dr. King and Malcolm X and the supposed conversation that happened, where Martin said, I'm doing all these things. I'm trying to get whites to understand. I'm trying to get people empowered to understand what I'm doing here, and I'm doing it in a nonviolent way. But you're creating problems for me. You're creating problems because you're being violent. And so now they're scared of all of us. And then Malcolm X said, no, and what I'm doing is showing them the alternative. If they don't work with you, they're gonna have to deal with me. And so I think you do need both. I don't think you can do either or. I think you've got to have people in the system working, and those people, when they get there, have to remember who they are and make sure that they take care of the people behind them while you have other people doing some things that are a little more radical.
And what happens when people don't remember who they are?
Oh, that is so painful. Okay, this is something I tell my students. When you get hired for a job and you're an underrepresented minority, or even sometimes a woman, do you think there was a white male that could have been hired? So you were probably hired partially because of who you are. You're expected to contribute something about who they think you are in that organization. So the worst thing you can do is not reach back, not pay attention, not do those things. And frankly, I've seen it in organizations where those people do get there and then they forget where they came from, and they're not helping others, and they get shunted aside as, kind of the one who sat by the door. So I really beg you to remember who you are, what you are, where you come from, because that's one of the reasons you were selected. There could have been a white male in your position.
Can I respond? I understand what you're saying. I will say, I think, though, that this kind of was something I was thinking about in response to the Dorner question as well, and this is something we struggle with all the time. But, oftentimes when we see a police misconduct, I think, the fact is you still can have people of color inside in a structurally, institutionally racist organization also commit acts of violence that are of racist nature. And so, we often say when we're dealing with police brutality, when police misconduct, the officers aren't black or white, they're blue. And so in that sense, I think that you're going to see there's a growing population of people of color in the criminal legal system. And I don't see that criminal legal system changing with their representation. So I think we also just have to recognize there are certain institutions that are based structurally, institutionally on racism. Right. And I don't believe by adding more people of color to that institution, you're going to change that foundation.
Do you think it's going to change with just the mere fact that 51% of the population will be minority in,
No.
what is it, 2048 or something like that?
I mean, that's another question. I don't think so. And I mean, you can look at countries like, look how long was South Africa, the government of South Africa and apartheid in place despite the majority population of black Africans. So.
But look at when they made the change, look at it. It was the fastest change you've ever seen. Even though it's still really problematic. I go there every year. It's still very problematic. But it's the fastest change. Like one generation ago, people were killing each other, and now they work side by side. So there is something there. I don't know exactly what all the details are, but when I asked them, they said it was a combination of their religious beliefs, the fact that they wanted to have a country left for their children. And then it was so interesting. I was at a BMW factory tour, and the head top management was there, black and white. And so they said these two things, and then one of the black guys said, and besides, there were so many of us, they were afraid we were going to murder them. And then the white people said, yes, we were. Very calmly, it's just as a matter of fact. So I think there's something, I think there is something about people getting into that system and not doing what they could do. I don't know if it's always the system. Systems only are people implementing them.
Yeah, but the systems have, as I think what Joey's saying, the systems are so set up. I've watched, for instance, police and good police officers come into the system and leave because they said, I can't stay in this, and they realized they could not change it because what they'll do is take a young black, white, brown cop to come in and, you're a new officer in it. They're going to put you with me, and I've been in for 25 years, and you come up with all these ideas on how you're going to treat people and respect people, and I tell you, you better shut the hell up because this is how it is, and we're out here every day, and you're going to get in line with me, or you're going to be outcast to this thing. So I think the systems, I think that's true with law enforcement. I think that's true with religion. I think that's true of corporate America. The systems are so that and I think numbers and groups are important, but I think until we face the larger question of dismantling systems, look at government. Why are we surprised at corruption in government? That has been what government is. Been. That has been and still is. Now, it's not about the corruption is less, it's about you've got to be more careful not to get caught. That's all it is. I mean, it's still the same mentality.
Right.
Don't tell me that anybody, in government right now, from Washington to Springfield to City Hall in Chicago or in Evanston, is any different than what Jesse Jackson did
No.
or Robert Goyevich did. It's just you got to be smarter.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the audience. So,
Agree with that.
Carice, any response to what you've heard?
Yes. I guess I'm trying to work on how I kind of want to phrase it and posit my response. I guess because I'm currently struggling with the notion of space in my life. And can we use, like, in you as an example, and I know, Professor Calvente, you talked about access as resistance to that space. So let's say I have access to this space and I'm acting in it because I'm a person of color. So therefore I'm acting in resistance to an extent. And my presence is kind of dismantling that space we kind of talked about. And perhaps I have a diverse set of ideals. But I feel like as I'm being educated within this space and in this institution, I begin to act as a middleman, as I'm using what I'm learning here at Northwestern as well as my own ideas. So I'm kind of like fumbling as to, I don't know, where do people of color belong and can operate in that space wholly without feeling like, I don't feel like I'm welcomed at Northwestern, even though I'm acting as resistance.
So you're raising the question, if you want to resist in these spaces, how is it possible to do that while you don't feel at home in these spaces? Is that what you're saying?
Sure, to an extent. Or also, like, where do you suggest people of color can belong and operate in a space wholly and feel like that's where they belong?
Okay. Who wants to respond?
Especially in, like, an educational institution like Northwestern. Well, it is a white institution.
Okay, let's take a few more contributions. Anyone else who wants to come in on this? Are there any other black people here? I just had to ask, I was blanking for a while, I was not too sure. Okay, who wants to respond from the panel to that question?
Wow. Okay. We're still struggling as scholars to find a space that we can locate as home space for the Black diaspora. So that's a rough question in that sense, in terms of the notion of belonging. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of, modernity and the construction of the nation state, I have yet to feel a sense of home space, a sense of belonging. So I can't answer that question for you in the sense of, well, this is a safe space. Because I think as long as racism exists in the world, right, and we can agree that the racism that we understand to be racism because of globalization is now across the globe in that sense, right? In particular ways and generalized ways. So in that sense, there isn't a safe space that we can say we fully and wholly belong, right?
Go ahead. No, you go first.
I was thinking that I never expect to find a safe space in those environments. I actually expect to find a safe community within the space. And I think probably every culture and every group may be doing that to some degree, but I really am not expected to find that. And it's great when you do, but I think you start with the construct of, we're gonna start with a smaller community group and that's gonna be my safe space to start and hopefully expand and grow. But I have to say, I don't expect it. Maybe it's my generation, though, because I may have been raised that way. And your generation is much more open, and maybe it's a little different.
But I think
Just take Michael, and then we'll take
Go for it.
I think one thing I think that, and this beyond the race and the class and the general, that is the fact of maturing to I think we all have a challenge to mature to a point where I'm comfortable with me. And we live in a world that always teaches us the importance of being validated and who likes you. We've read, the books, I'm Okay, You're Okay, and How to Win Friends, Influence People, and we should burn them all and stop worrying about who likes us and who doesn't like us. I'm not at home, young lady in the Catholic Church. I'm looked as on the fringe, or I'm looked as a problem to it. I'm in a all African American community as a white person, but I'm very much at home because it is where I live and it's been my home for 37 years. So I think you have to be comfortable with you and not worry about what people think or don't think of you. And I think one has to get to a point of one is comfortable enough and in love with oneself enough to feel okay with you and not have to get validation from anybody. That's, again, going back to the religious standpoint with me, that's why my relationship with God to me is the most important thing in my life, because ultimately that's the only thing, if I'm trying to be right with God, if man or woman does not like me, that's on them. You know, really, and I think we live in a society that is too concerned of who likes us and who likes it, and part of the whole climbing up the ladder, promotion and success and all the rest. Who the hell really cares? I want to be peaceful with me, and once I create, I think that place in myself, then I can have my space in the midst of somebody else's space, and I'm okay with that. And you don't have to like me and talk to me. You can point at me and laugh at me, and I'm fine. Give me another drink.
Okay, so I'm going to take Lisa, and then I'm going to move on to another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, building community is key in that sense. And maybe this is, a good point to differentiate between the notion of space and place, right? The difference between the actual place that you reside in that institution or whatever institution you find yourself at, and a notion of home space, which is built upon, notions of community, a connection with people, a shared experience, etc.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a slightly different question, trying to increase controversial dimensions. The next question comes from Heather Menifee, who is majoring in Native American Studies here. It's from Maryland. Heather, can you pose your question, please?
So my question has to do with a history that we've been uncovering at Northwestern specifically for about a year now. Northwestern recently instituted an investigative committee to look into the connection between one of its founders, John Evans, who Evanston is also named for, and the genocide of the Cheyenne Indians in Colorado. And my question is, if that connection is substantiated by the investigative committee, what ethical responsibilities does Northwestern have to act based on that recognition of that history?
Okay. Michele Rogers?
It's interesting. I look at the same thing as we think about with reparations and with supposedly Dartmouth College. This kind of thing happened with some other schools. We don't know that to be a fact, but it's rumored to be true. And I think that what we can do now is the same thing we're trying to do for other groups, is include them in the possibility of greater opportunities. I do think there's some onus on us, but I don't believe it's the same way as this tit for tat, because John Evans did these bad things. Northwestern University owes something. I think it's just the right thing to do anyway. So it transcends John Evans in my mind. But certainly I think that history, I'm a history major originally before I went to business school, and I'm all about history. I think that history needs to be told, shared, and people can learn from it. But I don't believe there's a direct tit for tat in this situation. I think we should be doing the right thing because we should be doing the right thing regardless of John Evans.
Joey?
I think there is an ethical responsibility for Northwestern, and I think it is the Northwestern University, and now that I know the town of Evanston, should take it on directly. I think reparations are hugely important. I think that our concept of reparations in this country is very poor, and that internationally and under human rights standards, there's a much fuller concept of reparations that we should bring to the United States. And we need to recognize that other countries are doing so much better at making amends and recognizing human rights violations, and we need to do that here. And I'm going to say this because I'm currently involved in a campaign for reparations for the Chicago police torture survivors. So I want to start off by talking about what I think could be done here and what I think should be happening in those cases. But I think if there is that connection and genocide of Native American people, I think that Evanston should officially apologize, and Northwestern should as well. I think that there should be some financial reparations made, and that there can be a committee and a commission that's set up to figure out how the Cheyenne or Arapaho tribes can be compensated. I think that at Northwestern itself could figure out ways to set aside tuition to help fund the tuition of Cheyenne and Arapaho Native Americans. And finally, I think that Northwestern should create a public memorial here on campus to memorialize that ugly history of genocide as opposed to pretending it didn't happen, and to serve as a reminder of an ugly history that we must remember so we're not doomed to repeat it. That's the struggle we have in the Chicago police torture cases right now. It's beyond question, it's beyond fact that over 100 African American men were tortured here in the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago admitted it back in 1993 when they fired the torture ringleader, John Birch. But we are now, 30 years later, the city of Chicago has never officially apologized for those human rights violations, for those crimes of torture. Meanwhile, there are scores of African American men and women who were tortured, who were wrongfully convicted, who have never and who cannot sue. They no longer can bring any lawsuits because the statute of limitations has expired. They are entitled to financial reparations. Still, the torture survivors to this day suffer psychologically as a result of the torture that occurred. I work with them. I can tell you, they still have nightmares. Some have moved out of the city of Chicago because they cannot stand seeing a Chicago police car. We should set up a psychological counseling center on the south side of Chicago to not only provide psychological and vocational training to those torture survivors, but to other police torture and brutality survivors here in the city of Chicago to this day. And finally, I think the city of Chicago needs to fund several public memorials with respect to the Chicago police torture survivors and to commemorate this history. We cannot ignore our ugly past. We must recognize it. We must take responsibility for it if we ever hope to have any future justice. So if you want more information about this, I would suggest going to chicagotorture.org. There is a group called the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project that is grappling with these issues of reparations. But I think there's a lot that Northwestern University can and should do with respect to these cases.
Lisa?
This is what troubles me about this case. One, that Northwestern University is not the first university to have a racist past or a past that's marked by mass genocide, violent exploitation, enslavement, etc., right? So that's one. I'm not sure I can think of a US structure that is not tied to this violent past, right, in terms of mass genocide. Now, with that said, we need to be really careful about these kinds of narratives because it acts as if Northwestern and John Evans is the exception to the norm, right? And what we need to realize, as Joey had just reminded us, mass genocide and violence happens on an everyday basis to predominantly peoples of the Black diaspora, right? And there are particular narratives that help to erase that notion of mass genocide and violence. And the way this narrative is constructed can possibly erase that kind of normativity in that sense, right? Where, the Black body is expendable, right? Exploitable, and basically under violent attack at every point in time.
Okay, just moving on to Michael Pfleger, but I noticed that we started off with the question that it was about Native Americans, and we ended up talking about Black bodies. And might that not be part of the problem when we're trying to assess these various entwined and overlapping histories and not losing some of the histories through a focus on particular communities? Michael?
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think it's the principle, and that underlines all. I mean, I think that I think Northwestern and Chase Bank and any place has been part of racism and prejudice, and the rest should be held accountable. They have to acknowledge it. They have to be responsible for it, and they can't keep the progressive thinking. Well, I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did. Well, okay. than give up the benefits you got that your ancestors gave you for your white privilege. So until there's that acknowledgement, and until there's the forgiveness for whether it's police department, whether it's the Native Americans, whether it's people of color or different gender, whatever it may be, until there's that acknowledgement of what has been done wrong and how people have been mistreated. And I think there should be reparation. And I think if the Native American that genocide thing happened from a founder here at Northwestern, then yes, there should be set up educational tuitions and grants and actively reaching out to bring folks into school here and all the rest, and teaching of the ugly history, to learn from that history, and all that I think should be done and more. But then finally, I guess though, to me is that with all that is now, if we look at ourselves as a university, as a church, as a government, as a police department, this is the history of John Burge 30 years ago. Right. But what the hell is happening right now, today? So what's happening is Northwestern, and again, I'm just using Northwestern because we're here, but do we still have an unwelcoming community? Do we still have where people, where there's prejudice and stereotypes consciously and unconsciously practiced? So even more importantly, it's not just rectifying the history of what's done, but what's happening right now. I mean, I look at, at the genocide that continues to go on in America that we ignite now, in Englewood and Lawndale and in Auburn Gresham. Nobody gave a damn about violence in America until 20 white children get killed in Newtown. And now it's a national issue, and that's horrific. But 112 babies died in Chicago last year, and nobody cares because, well, we don't expect it to happen here. In other words, you expect it to happen there, so that life is invaluable. And so until, it's not only doing all the historical stuff that has been done and rectifying and reparations and the rest, but God, how long we can continue it without addressing it, how we can continue racial profiling and torture and genocide and racism and sexism and all the stuff that goes on every day if we're still part, because we're more clever in it, or more sophisticated in it. So I think part of that, looking back at the history of Northwestern, is also looking at the day, present of Northwell. Let's bring in folks and say, what do you see now? The space that the young lady talked about. If you can't feel your space here at Northwestern, that's an issue. And to me, it's as big an issue as the genocide of the Native American, because you're here now.
Well, that was controversial.
Well, it'd be great.
Could we... Heather, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I have a few things that I want to say in response. The first is that I want to be careful to point out that I think that these histories and the way that violence against bodies has been normalized is very much related to the settler colonial nature of the United States. I don't think they can be separated, and I don't think it can be separated from the history of this institution. Second, I think that Northwestern has shown itself repeatedly to be hostile to people of color and to Native people specifically. I think we can see this when we look at the endowed chairs named after John Evans. I think we can see it when he's memorialized day in and day out every single year on Founders Day. Like, there are instances of Northwestern reconfirming what it is about and what it's not about. And it's definitely doesn't seem to be about any kind of like distributive justice or like actually understanding its past. Another thing to consider is that the genocide of Native peoples is like the foundational violence of this country. It's not like the foundational violence. It is the foundational violence of this country. And in a lot of ways, what we've found through our research is that it's the foundational financial basis of this university. The genocide happened because of financial interest in extending a railroad through Native territory. The best way to do that is to declare Native people hostile so you can move them off their land. Then you make a huge donation to a university which celebrates you as an abolitionist but forgets to mention what its actual financial basis is. So I think that these things are all related, and that the kind of space that Northwestern creates that we are all experiencing today in different ways is very much related to how it's allowed to think of itself in a particular way without actually ever thinking about itself in ways that would unsettle what it presumes to be a kind of space.
Okay.
I appreciate the education.
Any other points or questions from, please?
Would this be a stepping stone to addressing, I guess, the U.S. at large? Because if we take what's going on at Northwestern and apply it to not only every university across the nation, but also the nation itself, we celebrate Thomas Jefferson, don't get started on him.
Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
You know, our founding fathers, you know, teaching our children from a very young age, all the way up to like high school, about this, celebrating these people. I find that problematic. I find that problematic every day. So, and every day of my life, and every day that I have to see my 5-year-old niece go to class, I'm like, darn, when she gets to grammar school, what am I gonna have to? I'm gonna have to de-brainwash, you know? So, like, could that be a stepping stone towards that?
Okay, let's take a couple more if there are any other points or questions. Any other points or questions? Before we go back to the panel, let's go back to the panel. Oh, Dallas. Yeah.
Well, everyone, like, we're touching on it, kind of, but like Joey rattled off like 8 things that we need to get from CPD and Northwestern, and then finally rattled off like 4 more things, and then say, you know, and that's the very least of which, right? And so it's speaking to the fact that we really can't even conceive of what would be restorative, you know, what was taken. And not only that, we don't have the power to determine what's appropriate in terms of reparations, right? It does not lie with us. So people, you know, even financially, monetarily, there's, oh, if you ask for money, that's you're tripping, that's taboo, right? A recognition, like you said, isn't given. Whereas that's change in your pocket compared to what was taken, right? And so I think it's interesting that the discussion around reparations is so limited, right? Where really true reparations is the reconstruction of our entire world, is society, right? That would be actual reparations.
Okay. Any more? Panel, anyone want to respond to anything?
I just agree with what both of you said, because it is until we do the stepping stone to deal with the larger issue. That's true reparations. And, you know, band-aiding it is insulting.
Okay. The next question comes from Lucia Leon. Did I say that right? Leon? Is it Leon? Okay. So your question, please.
Hi. So my question is, how do you explain Black anti-immigrant sentiment?
Could you give a little bit of background to that question?
Sure. So I guess as disenfranchised populations, both immigrants and Blacks in the United States, how would you explain how Blacks as a disfranchised population can also perpetuate the disenfranchisement of other people?
Okay. So Lucia is a major in communication and African American studies. Lisa.
Quite simply, how do you explain it? It's racism, right? It's racism that comes from, again, the nation state, right? So we can tie this back into the history of the United States, if you will, right? And tie this into the narrative of the nation and how, you know, regardless of who we are, how we identify, we too are interpolated by these institutions, right? And these institutions are racist, they're sexist, they're homophobic, they're classist, etc. Just because we're people of color in that sense doesn't mean that we're excluded from this interpolation, from these processes, right, that make us think what we think in terms of our everyday lives, in terms of common sense. So that's the simple answer, right? It's racism. It's racist ideology that, you know, enables us to feel like we belong to this country when really we do not, right? So if anything, it's almost a simulation of citizenship.
Joey?
I guess I would question, has there been a rise of black anti-immigrant sentiment? And I say that because I think that the media does a really poor job of covering these issues. And I think often what we see is marginalized groups getting pitted against one another. And so I'm not going to say that folks aren't anti-immigrant. I think that you're going to expect to see that because look how much anti-immigrant sentiment exists. And I would echo what Lisa said, that it's foundational to this country. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I get really concerned when I hear about the rise, or about how, for example, for years we've heard about how the black community, like it's monolithic, is more homophobic or transphobic than other communities of color. And I think that's a completely false analogy, and I think that that's been goaded by the right wing and of the white ring that has been promoting that narrative. So I guess I have to just pose, I question the concept that there's been a rise of black anti-immigrant sentiment. Says who? And who's in a position to say that?
Okay. Michael?
The only thing I'd add in is I think that part of it is the whole divide and conquer. And the institution, the system, the status quo says if they can create a divide and conquer mentality, it keeps both groups fighting each other and doesn't allow anybody to deal with the real issue. I mean, living in the African American community, I've watched the flyers pass out, and I've watched by the right wing come up to talk about, look at these folks who are not citizens are taking all these jobs, and never acknowledge that if you just brought back a piece of all the jobs you sent overseas, we could all have a job. But you won't address the real issue of where we sent our jobs, and you want to turn a division and a conflict amongst folks here in America, particularly the black and brown, because if there's ever a uniting of people of color, and there's ever a uniting of class, there'll be a real revolution. And they will do everything they can to stop that.
Would that be an armed revolution? I'm just looking for clarification.
I'm a disciple of Dr. King.
I know.
So nonviolence always wins.
Michele?
Actually, I agree with Father Pfleger quite a bit, because I see it as primarily ignorance and economics.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the media pushing a certain view, and that's what you see, and that's what you hear, and that's what you know, then that leads to the ignorance. But then the economics that go with it is, if you don't have what you think you should have, or don't have what you need or want, or aren't at the safety level, then you blame the new people.
Right.
And that's been done throughout generations, whether it's all over the world. So and I remember the worst example I can think of. I remember my ex-husband telling me a story of being on the south side of Chicago. And so they were sitting, he and his friends were sitting together, and they said, wow, the neighborhood's looking up. White people have moved in, because a new neighbor had moved in. And somebody said, no, they're Puerto Rican, they're worse than us. Oh, okay. And it's amazing to me, that story just signified so much, because they're being taught at a young age, but it's from ignorance and economics, in my opinion.
Right.
Okay, Lucia? Oh, sorry, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I just want you all to keep in mind that, yes, there is an anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, and that is tied to citizenship. And it doesn't matter if we are people of color or not, right? If we buy into ideas of citizenship, ideas of the nation state, we buy into this anti-immigrant sentiment. It's why there are Latinos who are policing the border, right? For the safety of those who are coming over, right? That's the narrative in that sense. And it's why there are people, who are not of working class background, but of, bourgeois backgrounds that feel the same exact way in terms of immigration, right? So I do appreciate what the panelists are saying, but we also need to tie this to, I think, larger issues of modernity in the nation state.
Okay. Lucia, do you want to respond?
Sure, I guess my only response was that Yeah, I agree with Joey in that I tried to eliminate the rise, because I do agree that there hasn't really been a rise, that it's always kind of been there, even like not only among blacks and immigrants, but any disenfranchised people that, like you said about, about the divide and conquer, like dividing people as much as possible so that people don't realize their difference, or their similarities, I mean.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try and fit in a couple of more questions, but does anyone want to respond to this one before we move on? Please.
I wanted to add, I guess I don't want to forget that there are black immigrants as well. And that's a large part, I think, what was missing in this dialogue. That's all.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think some of the anti-immigration sentiment came from the fact that there was a feeling that blacks were not allowed to immigrate as easily or as often as other groups.
Right.
So I do think that was the perception, whether that's true or not. And I do think there's some sentiment because of
Okay.
that.
Going to try and fit in two final questions. The next question comes from Ayana Legros, who is a major in African American Studies and International Studies. So.
I hope this is not repetitive. I think it's been addressed, but can there be racial justice for blacks in America without a successful movement for feminist and LGBTQ rights?
Michael.
Oh, really? Well, I think there has to be within us all a struggle for equality and justice, that none of us can marginalize it's just my issue or my concern or my personal desire. I think that there has to be for lack of a better word, a dissatisfaction or a divine tension in us that whenever injustice is, that we fight it and we address it and we expose it and we try to tear it down. So I think in that sense that any struggle for equality has to be everybody's struggle for equality. And it's real idealistic, but that's what I believe. But I also think we have to understand that John Johnson, the founder of Ebony magazine, said that then, and was still said by a study by Harvard University about 2 years ago, the #1 judgment factor in America is still color. And that I can be white and be gay or be poor or be whatever, and I'm still white. And if I'm African American, the color judgment factor is always the first judgment factor of the human race. So I guess I'm saying both and. We have to acknowledge that reality. But I also think we have to become a people that says that I'm going to fight injustice anywhere, and that everybody has to have an equal playing field. And until we get to that day, none of us can be silent.
Joey?
I just think this kind of gets back to what the speaker just said. It's this idea that black folks are straight, and then LGBT people are white, and that feminists are white. And it's just like, how can there be progress for black people if it doesn't also include concepts that are free of homophobia and transphobia? Because there are scores of queer and trans black folks out there who are suffering the same types of racism that everyone else is. So I don't believe there can really truly be any progress for black people without including feminist and anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic core values. And that said, I guess I feel like, I don't really see a feminist or an LGBT rights movement right now. I don't see that at all. And I think I also question what kind of movement we truly have that's a racial justice movement. I think we have a lot of non-for-profits out there, and I think
but
that's
no movements.
Yes,
Right.
I think that's radically different than movements. And so, I would like us to stop. I'm not going to deny that I think racism is a huge factor that, and I don't want to play a hierarchy of oppression, but I think racism is a huge structural factor that must be addressed in any movement for justice in this country. And I guess I would hope that in addition to being anti-racist, it would also be feminist and it would be humanist, and I think that that would include all issues of integrity and bodily integrity and human dignity, so that we wouldn't have to splice it out.
Michele?
I feel very similar. I try to keep things simple, and stories help me tell, explain where I feel. I was a pastor, although I like St. Sabina on Christmas Eve, I was somewhere else. Once said, if you have one of those friends who treats people bad, who lies, who cheats, who steals, but they treat you really well, just wait, your turn is coming. And I believe that. I've seen it, I know it's true. And I feel the same way about this issue. If you're not paying attention to the welfare, care of everybody, you're still hurting yourself. And that's why I think we have a hard time getting the majority population to understand. It's going to hurt you too. You have to help and include everybody. And so that's my statement on this.
Lisa?
I agree, right? You can't have a movement for social justice without attacking all the isms per se, right? So, and history has already showed us that, right? If you focus on one thing and not the other things, if you focus on, racial equality and not women equality or LGBTQI rights, those certain spaces are even further marginalized, right? And then there's a reinforcement of, oppression, racist oppression, sexist oppression, homophobia, and a reinforcement of normativity.
Okay, Iana, would you like to respond?
Yes, please. So I'm throwing in another component, if that's okay. We're being controversial. No? So
okay.
If I'm thinking about
I know.
the growing, I guess, uproar of, or I think Obama has received criticism since day one of his presidency, but I think it's interesting that he took a very specific approach to, I know you argue that you don't feel that there's a particular LGBTQ movement going on right now, but he's very much tried to rally him, or I guess present himself as the president who has cared the most about those specific issues. So I asked this question because I'm still, I guess, struggling with the fact that, I feel like Obama still tried to pigeonhole himself as a leader in that respect, but has still there's still black people who are yelling, "You have not done enough for us. You have not done enough for Chicagoans who are black in the South Side." So how can we, I guess, address those two kind of critiques?
Sure.
Well,
Go ahead. Please, Father
you go
Pfleger.
first.
No, you go first.
Let me settle down a little bit. Give me a chance.
I would say, okay. I know that the Obama administration has, said that it, reversed don't ask, don't tell, so that gay people can be in the military. Transgender people cannot at this point, it's still a low. And I know that he has now come out in favor of same-sex marriage, okay? I'll just be honest with you. I'm not a big fan of same-sex marriage. I'm not a big fan of heterosexual marriage. I'm not a big fan of the fact that benefits are afforded to people based on these very traditional conservative families. And so in that sense, I think, honestly, I do think it's the right thing, because obviously it's unfair that gay and transgender people can't get married. But that said, I don't think it's a really truly radical or progressive movement or cause. And after marriage is gained, which I have no doubt it will be, we're still going to see so many people left behind, including a lot of queer and trans people of color, okay? So it's at its heart is somewhat of a conservative notion that he's supporting. I would agree that I don't think the Obama administration has done enough to deal with issues of racism and poverty in America, okay? But I'm just saying that as a member of the LGBT movement, as a queer person, I don't feel that my issues are being represented by the Obama administration. And my biggest issue right now is mass incarceration and how that's affecting folks. And so I would like to see the Obama administration truly deal with those issues. I would love to hear what the rest of the panel has to say.
Okay. Michael.
Well, let me say, I hear what you're saying, Joey, and I agree with you, because I don't think enough has been done, by just dealing with the don't ask, don't tell, or dealing with him coming out and saying that he believes in same-sex marriage, or pushing for the DREAM Act or immigration plans. I think all those are limited things, but those are things he's done. And when I look in terms of the African American community, I'm one of these folks that I'm sick and tired of a feeling that he cannot say things because he can be identified as the black president and not the president. Look in the damn mirror. You are a black president, and you have to acknowledge that. If you're not going to deal with racism in America, did you think Mitt Romney was?
Exactly.
So the fact that I vote for you and I work for you and I struggle for you is I expect you to deal with issues that others will not. And I get even angrier with this kind of sense still, in the whole second term thing, that what's going to be different in the second term. Well, we'll see. Because I don't know how much control he's even going to have in the second term, because the Democrats are worried about 2016 and what control he's going to be able to do. But I have a real problem with the fact people saying, when they tell me, well, you're too critical about President Obama, or Cornel West is too critical, or Lupe Fiasco, or anybody else. Hold up. I criticize Eisenhower, I criticize Kennedy, I criticize Carter, I'm going to criticize anybody in that role for challenging them to do what I think they should do as president. He's the president of the United States. And no, I do not think he's done enough about the African American community. I don't think he's done enough about poverty and the fact that the worst schools and the most unemployment and the mass incarceration is in African American neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods around this country is sinful and shameful. And I think if he does not do something about race, it's going to be what Clinton had Rwanda, racism is going to be President Obama's.
Any other responses?
I basically have to say that we didn't have a choice anyway. I mean, I go back to that. There was no better choice. But I do think more can be done. And it is my fervent hope that in the second term more will be done. But at the same time, I do appreciate, again, I do acknowledge the things that were done with, I focus a lot on education and business. Mm-hmm. So the fact that the loan programs were a little better, those kinds of things, I do appreciate them, but I want to see more. I so want to see more. He came in the worst times ever. This is probably another reason why somebody black can get it. We always get everything when nobody else wants it. So, exactly. We even had pirates. Who has pirates? I mean, it was crazy. So he had a lot to deal with. And I give some slack for that, but it's time. I want to see some more, some stronger results in the second term. It is wait and see.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think we're asking a lot of President Obama in terms of this radical change, right? He is the president of the United States. And I think we forget that, right? And we see a black president and we demand things from him that we do not demand of other presidents. And we demand them more enthusiastically, right? And perhaps that's more about the representation of blackness and black men in particular, where they're either treated as superhuman or subhuman, right? So I wanna, bring that up in the sense that, yes, we might ask of President Eisenhower or President Bush Sr. and Jr. To resolve certain aspects of racism, but I don't think we have asked them to do the same kinds of things we've asked Obama to do as a nation, right? As citizens of a nation in that sense. And that's precisely because he's the black president, right? The black president. And of course, he's going to implement more conservative, policies, especially if you're, a radical leftist, you're gonna see them as conservative, right? He's the president of the United States. He's not the leader of the Black Panther Party. He's not the next leader of the new left global revolutionary party, right? He's working within the confines of a state that's already set up to be racist, to serve capitalism, right? To serve as a global power and all those kinds of social inequalities that actually means, right?
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I do think also, though, this isn't just related to Obama, but it was related to Clinton as well. I think there's also a way that just the Democrats get a pass on a whole host of issues. And so, let me say, I'm really upset with Obama's foreign policy. And I'm upset with the fact that we still have torture and that that's not being condemned whatsoever. And I think the fact that because he's a Democrat, he doesn't get the criticism, and you don't have as much of it discussed in the media as you did with President Bush. And that is truly problematic. Yes, I understand what you're saying. What are our expectations? Well, I think our expectations should be as high as they ought to be.
Right.
We want to see justices in this world, and I'm not going to give him a pass because things are hard, or because, I do think he has it harder as the first black president. I think he still faces racism. I mean, obviously, here he is at the president, and we still have a birthers movement, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, but that doesn't mean we give him a pass, The fact that he's playing within the norms, I don't think that should give him a pass either. I mean, I'll say one thing. During the primaries in 2008, one thing he said about, I think it was a question posed to him and Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, like, who would Martin Luther King vote for? And he said, well, he wouldn't be voting for any of us. He'd be outside protesting us.
That's true.
Right.
We should all be outside protesting Obama. And the fact that he's
And
our
any
first black
president.
president, it makes no difference. Where there are policies that he's instituting, we can't give him a pass. We need to be protesting. And I'll say this: I feel like, I do think he did certain things in the LGBT rights movement. Or not rights movement. I can't call it a movement, but I think because it's not. But it's I do think people have been pushing him, people have been prodding him, and I also think he wanted to play to liberals. And so these were easy decisions he could make. We don't see the change on torture. We don't see the drone policy being disclosed. That said, I do think with the DREAM movement, I want to say I do think there is a Dreamers movement, and I do think they forced Obama's hand. And I want to just recognize that. If we want to see change from Obama, then we should be out there protesting and creating the movement to force his hand.
Okay. Well, that was our final question. I just want to get one of the students, Paul Jackson, to say some final words. Could take a couple of minutes, but can we thank the panel for their contribution today?
Thank you. And thank you to the guests today. Before we leave tonight, on behalf of the committee, Amrit Troon, Ben Ratzhoff, myself, again under the guidance of Christine Golding and mentorship of Professor Barner Hesse, who was our mentor and our moderator tonight. I'd like to thank all the panelists for your time today. Your contributions, your interventions were certainly controversial and enriching, and we can't thank you enough. I'd also like to thank, for the entire series of events this month, the Department of African American Studies for sponsoring this series of events. Thank you. I'd like to thank the McCormick Tribune staff for hosting us. I'd like to thank Peter Picoult for filming. You were awesome. And then I'd like to thank you, the Northwestern and Evanston and Chicago communities, for walking this controversial road with us. It was a challenging and enriching time that we spent together. It's something that we can all take with us each and every way that we go. Thank you very much. Thank you.